Rain swept across Ashton Manor in silver sheets, turning the gardens into dark blurs beyond the tall windows. The ancient house stood against the storm like a weary soldier, its stone walls holding generations of secrets, disappointments, and sacrifices. Lightning flashed over the distant hills, illuminating the manor for a heartbeat before darkness swallowed it again. Inside, silence ruled the corridors. Then a scream shattered it. Countess Marvell Ashton stood in her eldest daughter's bedchamber, a crumpled letter trembling in her hand. Her face had gone pale with fury. She has fled. The servants standing nearby lowered their eyes immediately. No one dared speak. The letter slipped from Marvell's fingers onto the floor. Seraphina Ashton, the family's celebrated beauty and future Duchess of Veyron, had vanished during the night. The wedding was scheduled for dawn. The Duke's guests were already gathering. The contracts had been signed. The arrangements had cost fortunes. And the bride was gone. Marvell's expression hardened into something colder than anger. Something calculating. Slowly, her gaze shifted toward the doorway. Toward the daughter nobody had considered. Elara Ashton stood frozen there. At 24, she possessed none of Seraphina's celebrated confidence. Her beauty was quieter, hidden beneath gentleness and years of being overlooked. Soft chestnut hair framed a face that carried kindness even when burdened by sorrow. The moment her mother's eyes settled on her, dread tightened around her heart. "No," Elara whispered. Marvell stepped forward. "You will take her place." The word struck harder than a slap. "No. You will." "Mama, please." The Countess seized her wrist. "You will wear the gown. You will enter the chapel. You will marry Duke Alistair Veyron." Tears filled Elara's eyes. "He will know. He will know after the ceremony." The cruelty of the answer stole Elara's breath. "This is wrong." Marvell's grip tightened. "Do you know what happens if this alliance collapses?" Elara remained silent. "Our family is ruined. Mama. You owe this family everything." Elara looked toward the letter lying on the floor. For a moment she imagined running. Just once. Just this once. Then years of obedience closed around her like chains. She heard her mother's voice from countless childhood lessons. A wife must endure. A daughter must endure. Whatever happens, just endure. The words had shaped her entire life. Now they were delivering her to a stranger. 3 hours later she stood before a mirror wearing her sister's wedding gown. White silk spilled across the floor. Pearls glittered along the sleeves. The dress fit almost perfectly. That somehow made everything worse. A maid lowered the veil over her face. The world became a blur. Elara barely recognized the woman staring back. She looked like a bride. She felt like a sacrifice. The journey to Veyron Palace passed in silence. Rain drummed against the carriage roof. Fields and villages vanished behind gray curtains of weather. Elara clasped her trembling hands together. Every mile carried her farther from the life she knew, closer to a future she had never chosen. By midday the palace emerged through the storm. Veyron Palace dominated the landscape like a kingdom unto itself. Its towers pierced the clouds. Its walls stretched endlessly. Its windows reflected silver light from the rain. Power seemed woven into every stone. Elara's stomach twisted. The carriage rolled through iron gates. Servants hurried across the courtyard. Guests filled the entrance hall. Music drifted through the air. Everything was ready. Everything except the right bride. The ceremony began less than an hour later. The chapel glowed with candlelight. Nobles packed every pew. Whispers floated through the air. Elara walked down the aisle unable to feel her feet. At the altar stood Duke Alistair Veyron. He was taller than she expected. Broad-shouldered. Impossibly composed. Dark hair framed a face carved by discipline and restraint. The stories had called him cold. The stories had not captured the force of his presence. He looked like a man who commanded storms. The moment arrived. Alistair lifted the veil. His gray eyes met hers. Everything stopped. The Duke knew instantly. She saw recognition. Confusion. Then fury. His jaw tightened. The temperature in the chapel seemed to drop. Gasps sounded from nearby guests. Alistair looked at her for a long moment. Then beyond her. Toward Countess Marvell. Understanding settled into his expression. A dangerous understanding. Elara could barely breathe. The ceremony could still be stopped. The scandal could still erupt. He could expose her before everyone. Instead, the Duke turned back toward the officiant. His face became unreadable. Continue. The single word echoed through the chapel. The vows proceeded. The documents were signed. The marriage became legal. Applause followed. It sounded distant, unreal. By sunset Elara had become Duchess of Veyron. By sunset she was also more alone than she had ever been. The reception passed in a blur of fearful smiles and unanswered questions. Alistair barely spoke. Guests watched them constantly. Speculation filled every corner of the ballroom. When the final dance ended, the Duke disappeared without explanation. Night settled over the palace. A maid escorted Elara to her chambers. The room was magnificent. Gold accents gleamed beneath candlelight. Velvet curtains framed towering windows. A fire crackled in the hearth. Yet none of it comforted her. She sat on the edge of the bed waiting. Minutes stretched into hours. Every sound made her flinch. She had heard enough stories about powerful husbands. Enough stories about unwanted brides. Enough stories about what happened behind closed doors. At last the door opened. Alistair entered. The room immediately felt smaller. Elara rose to her feet. Her hands shook visibly. The Duke studied her. Not with anger now. Not even with disappointment. Something far more complicated moved behind his eyes. He crossed the room slowly. Then stopped. "You are frightened." It was not a question. Elara lowered her gaze. "I am sorry." The words escaped before she could stop them. For what? For all of this. Silence stretched between them. Finally, Alistair exhaled. "I don't know what game your family is playing." His voice remained calm, measured, dangerously controlled. Elara waited for judgment. Instead, he said quietly, "But you will not be harmed in this house." She stared at him, certain she had misheard. The Duke looked toward the fire, then back at her. "You have my word." The promise broke something inside her. Not because it was grand, not because it solved anything, but because it was the first kindness anyone had offered her all day. Perhaps the first kindness offered without condition in years. Tears slipped down her cheeks. Alistair noticed. For a moment, something almost like regret crossed his face. Then he turned and walked toward the door. When it closed behind him, Elara remained standing in the candlelight. Married to a stranger. Trapped inside a palace built on deception. Protected by a man who had every reason to hate her. And for the first time since dawn, that frightened her far less than it should have. The days that followed settled over Veyron Palace like a beautiful prison. Everything Elara could possibly need appeared before she asked for it. Fresh flowers arrived each morning. Fires were lit before dawn. Servants stood ready at every doorway. Gowns filled wardrobes she had never requested. Jewels glittered from velvet boxes. Yet comfort was not the same thing as belonging. The whispers began almost immediately. They followed her through corridors lined with portraits and across marble floors polished to perfection. The replacement bride. The spare daughter. The woman who tricked a duke. Whenever she approached, conversations dissolved into silence. Whenever she left, they resumed. Elara endured it the way she had endured everything else. Quietly. Without complaint. Without defense. The palace itself seemed determined to remind her how small she was. Its endless halls stretched like rivers of stone. Towering windows flooded rooms with pale winter sunlight. Ancient tapestries depicted generations of Veyrons who had ruled, fought, married, and shaped kingdoms. Elara often felt as though those painted ancestors were watching her, judging her, waiting for her to fail. Duke Alistair remained a distant figure moving through that vast world. He treated her with flawless courtesy. He never insulted her, never raised his voice, never reminded her of the deception that had brought her there. Yet he kept an invisible wall between them. At breakfast he asked if she slept well. At dinner he inquired about her day. Nothing more. Nothing personal. Nothing warm. When conversations ended, silence returned. Sometimes Elara thought silence was the language he spoke best. One snowy morning she watched him from a library window. Below in the training yard he directed soldiers through drills. The men obeyed instantly. No hesitation. No questions. His authority seemed effortless. Yet something about him appeared lonely. The realization surprised her. Power usually attracted people. Alistair seemed surrounded by distance instead. A soft knock interrupted her thoughts. A maid entered carrying tea. "Your Grace, the East Wing remains closed today." Elara blinked. "I did not ask about the East Wing." The maid's expression shifted nervously. Most people eventually do. Before Elara could question her further, the woman hurried away. Curiosity lingered. Several days later she found herself wandering unfamiliar corridors while searching for a conservatory mentioned in an old guidebook. Instead she reached a neglected section of the palace. Dust covered forgotten tables. Curtains remained half drawn. The silence felt different there. Sadder. Then she heard laughter. Not cheerful laughter. The kind children force themselves to make when they are trying not to cry. Elara followed the sound. At the end of the corridor stood a small sitting room. Inside sat a young girl beside a window. She could not have been older than 8. Golden hair fell around delicate shoulders. A sketchbook rested in her lap. She looked up immediately. Large gray eyes met Elara's. The resemblance to Alistair was unmistakable. For several seconds neither spoke. Then the child asked quietly, "Are you the new Duchess?" Elara nodded. "And you're Rosalind?" The girl seemed startled. "How do you know my name?" "Because your father mentions you." The answer was only partly true. Servants mention Rosalind often. Always in whispers. Always with pity. Rosalind lowered her gaze. "Most people forget I'm here." The words hurt more than they should have. Elara crossed the room slowly and sat nearby. Outside, snow drifted across the gardens. Inside, loneliness sat between them. "May I see your drawings?" Elara asked. Rosalind hesitated before offering the sketchbook. The pages revealed flowers, birds, and castles. Every picture contained one detail repeated again and again. A woman, sometimes standing beside Rosalind, sometimes holding her hand, sometimes smiling. The same woman appeared on nearly every page. "My mother," Rosalind said softly. Elara's chest tightened. "I thought so." Rosalind traced one of the drawings with her fingertip. "I don't remember her voice anymore." The confession was almost a whisper. Elara struggled for a response. No child should have to carry grief that heavy. "Then perhaps," she said carefully, "you can remember how she made you feel." Rosalind considered that. For the first time a faint smile appeared. From that day forward, Elara returned whenever she could. They read stories together. Played simple games. Walked through sheltered gardens when weather allowed. Elara braided Rosalind's hair. Rosalind taught Elara which palace staircases led to secret balconies. Little by little the child began changing. Laughter came easier. Smiles lasted longer. The sadness never vanished completely, but it loosened its grip. One evening Elara was reading aloud beside the fireplace when Rosalind suddenly laughed so hard she nearly dropped her book. The sound filled the room. Bright. Unrestrained. Alive. Neither noticed the figure standing beyond the doorway. Alistair had arrived several minutes earlier. He remained motionless, watching. His daughter had not laughed like that in years. Something shifted across his features. Something fragile. Elara looked up and saw him. The moment shattered. Rosalind immediately straightened. Alistair entered quietly. For a brief second his eyes met Elara's. Neither mentioned what he had witnessed. "Good evening, Rosalind." "Good evening, Papa." The child smiled. Actually smiled. Alistair noticed. So did Elara. The Duke remained only a few minutes before leaving again. Yet afterward, something subtle changed. The next morning a book appeared outside Elara's door. It was a collection of poetry she had admired in the library. No note accompanied it. The following week she mentioned feeling cold during evening walks. The next morning a beautiful wool shawl waited on a chair beside the fireplace. Again no explanation. A few days later a single white rose appeared in a crystal vase. No card. No signature. No acknowledgement. Elara knew exactly who sent them. She never spoke of it. Neither did Alistair. Yet every gift felt like a conversation neither knew how to have. Winter deepened. Snow covered the palace grounds. And for the first time since arriving, Elara began waking without dread. Hope crept into her heart quietly. Dangerously. One afternoon a distinguished guest arrived at Veyron Palace. Lord Cedric Voss. Tall, elegant, and perpetually smiling. The sort of man who appeared charming until one looked carefully into his eyes. Those eyes missed very little. He greeted Alistair warmly. Bowed to Elara perfectly. Then held her gaze 1 second too long. Recognition flickered there. Sure. Calculating. It vanished immediately. But Elara saw it. So did he. That evening Cedric entertained guests with stories and laughter. Everyone seemed delighted by him. Everyone except Elara. She sensed something predatory beneath the polished surface. Several times she caught him studying her from across the room. Like a man examining a weakness in a fortress wall. Meanwhile Rosalind continued flourishing. The child spent less time alone. More time smiling. One snowy evening they sat together arranging pressed flowers inside a scrapbook. Rosalind carefully placed a white blossom between 2 pages. Then she looked up. Without thinking. Without hesitation. "Mama, does this one belong here?" The room went completely still. The word hung in the air. Rosalind's face drained of color. Elara's heart stopped. The child looked horrified. I didn't mean. A voice interrupted from the doorway. Neither had noticed Alistair standing there. For a long moment he said nothing. His gaze moved from Rosalind to Elara. The entire future seemed balanced upon his response. Rosalind lowered her eyes, waiting to be corrected, waiting to be reminded of what had been lost. But Alistair simply stood there, watching them together. And to Elara's astonishment, he did not tell his daughter she was wrong. Winter arrived in full splendor at Veyron Palace. Snow draped the gardens in white silk. Crystal chandeliers glittered like captured stars. Musicians filled the grand ballroom with elegant melodies that drifted through marble corridors and gilded galleries. The Winter Sovereign Ball was the most anticipated event of the season. Nobles traveled from every corner of the kingdom to attend. For Elara, it felt less like a celebration and more like a trial. She stood before her mirror while maids adjusted the final details of her silver gown. The fabric shimmered softly in candlelight. Diamonds sparkled at her throat. She looked every inch a duchess. Yet old fears lingered beneath the elegance. Some wounds learned to hide without ever healing. When she entered the ballroom beside Alistair, conversations paused. Hundreds of eyes followed them. Months earlier, those stares had been filled with curiosity. Now many carried something darker. Suspicion, judgment, resentment. Alistair offered his arm. Elara accepted it. The simple gesture steadied her more than she wanted to admit. The ballroom itself was magnificent. Golden balconies overlooked polished floors. Fresh winter roses decorated every table. Noble women laughed behind jeweled fans. Statesmen discussed alliances over crystal glasses. At the center of it all moved Lord Cedric Voss. He looked perfectly at home. Perfectly charming. Perfectly dangerous. Throughout the evening, Elara noticed him watching. Always smiling. Always calculating. As though waiting for the exact moment to strike. The moment came after midnight. The orchestra finished a waltz. Applause echoed through the hall. Cedric stepped forward holding a champagne glass. "My friends," he called pleasantly. The room gradually quieted. Alistair's expression hardened immediately. He recognized trouble. Cedric raised his glass. "I believe tonight deserves honesty." The atmosphere shifted. Elara felt it instantly. The way animals sense a storm before it breaks. Several guests exchanged uncertain glances. Cedric smiled wider. After all, truth is a gift. Nobody interrupted him. Nobody moved. The trap had already closed. His gaze settled directly on Elara. "Tell me, Your Grace." The title sounded almost mocking. "Do these people know who you really are?" Silence swept across the ballroom. Elara's heartbeat thundered. Cedric continued. "Or should I say who you are not?" Whispers erupted immediately. Alistair's jaw tightened. Still Cedric pressed forward. "The woman standing before you is not Serafina Ashton." Gasps spread through the crowd. The Duke did not marry the bride promised to him. More whispers followed. Shock transformed rapidly into fascination. Like wolves scenting blood. Cedric's voice remained smooth. "He married her sister instead." The ballroom exploded with murmurs. Ladies leaned toward one another. Gentlemen exchanged startled looks. Every eye turned toward Elara. Heat flooded her face. The humiliation was immediate. Brutal. She suddenly felt 24 years of rejection pressing down upon her shoulders. The overlooked daughter. The unwanted child. The replacement. One noblewoman laughed softly. Another whispered something cruel enough to make her companion smirk. Elara stood completely alone at the center of the room. Exactly where Cedric wanted her. Exactly where her mother had always left her. A spare. A substitute. A convenient sacrifice. Cedric spread his hands dramatically. Surely such deception deserves explanation. No one came to her defense. No one except the man beside her. For one terrible moment, Alistair remained still. The silence stretched. Every second felt endless. Even Elara wondered what he would choose. Then he moved. Without hurry. Without hesitation. He crossed the small distance separating them. Took her hand. And turned toward the crowd. His gray eyes swept across the ballroom. The temperature seemed to drop. "I am aware of exactly who my wife is." The words landed with the force of a blade. Silence followed instantly. No one dared speak. No one dared breathe. Alistair's voice remained calm. Controlled. Far more frightening than anger. "Do you have further business with my wife?" The question was simple. The warning beneath it was unmistakable. Cedric's smile faltered. Several nobles immediately lowered their eyes. Others suddenly found their drinks fascinating. The crowd parted. The attack had failed. At least publicly. Alastair offered Elara his arm again. This time she accepted it with trembling fingers. Together they walked from the ballroom. No one attempted to stop them. The doors closed behind them. Only then did Elara release the breath she had been holding. The silence between them felt entirely different now. Not hostile. Not distant. Heavy. Necessary. Alastair led her to a private drawing room overlooking moonlit gardens. The fire crackled softly. Snow drifted beyond the windows. For several moments neither spoke. Then Alastair poured 2 glasses of water, handed one to her, and said quietly, "Tell me everything." There was no accusation in his voice. Only certainty. Only truth. So Elara told him. She told him about Serafina's disappearance. About her mother's command. About the wedding gown forced upon her trembling shoulders. About a childhood spent surrendering pieces of herself to keep peace within the family. The words poured out. Years of silence breaking apart. Alastair listened without interruption. Without judgment. When she finally finished, exhaustion settled over her. The room became still again. Alastair rose from his chair. Walked toward the window. Looked out into the darkness. For a long time he said nothing. Elara feared she had finally lost him. Then he spoke. "Your mother used you as a pawn." His voice was low, measured. "And I treated you as a problem." Emotion tightened unexpectedly in his expression. "We have both wronged you." Elara stared at him. No one had ever apologized to her before. Not sincerely. Not without demanding something in return. The realization struck deeper than she expected. Slowly Alastair turned toward her. For the first time since their marriage, the distance between them seemed to disappear. Not completely. But enough. Enough to let something fragile begin. A knock interrupted the moment. 3 sharp knocks. Urgent. Unexpected. Alastair frowned. A servant entered. His face had gone pale. "Your Grace." "What is it?" "There is a woman at the gates." The servant swallowed hard. "She insists she must see the Duchess immediately." Confusion crossed Elara's face. At this hour, no visitor should have been arriving. Alastair stepped forward. "Who is she?" The servant hesitated. Then answered. "Miss Serafina Ashton." The room went completely silent. Elara's heart stopped. 4 months her sister had existed only as questions and unanswered fears. Now she was here. Alive. Waiting. Moments later the doors opened. A woman entered. At first Elara barely recognized her. Serafina looked nothing like the radiant beauty who had vanished before the wedding. She appeared thinner. Paler. Broken. Dark circles shadowed her eyes. Her hands trembled visibly. The confidence she once carried so effortlessly had vanished. Tears filled her eyes the moment she saw Elara. "I'm sorry." The words shattered from her lips. Elara rushed forward instinctively. Despite everything. Despite the pain. She embraced her sister. Serafina broke down immediately. Weeks of fear and guilt pouring out. Alastair remained silent. Watching carefully. Waiting. Eventually Serafina managed to compose herself. Barely. Then she revealed the truth. Lord Cedric Voss had approached her months before the wedding. Not as a friend. Not as an admirer. But as a predator. He possessed documents connected to financial irregularities involving the Ashton family. Forged records. False debts. Evidence capable of destroying their family name. Cedric threatened exposure unless she cooperated. When she resisted, the threats escalated. He convinced her that marrying Alastair would place everyone in danger. Terrified and manipulated, she fled. Exactly as Cedric intended. Every step had been calculated. Every consequence predicted. The wedding disaster. The substitute bride. The scandal. All of it. A design years in the making. Alastair's expression darkened with every word. The pieces were finally connecting. Yet Serafina had one final revelation. One that chilled the room. Cedric's goal had never been the Ashton family. They had merely been tools. His true target was House Veyron itself. The false marriage would allow him to challenge the legitimacy of the union. If the marriage collapsed, he intended to drag the estate into years of legal chaos. Long enough to seize influence, wealth, and control through allies hidden within the courts. As Serafina finished speaking, a second knock echoed through the room. This one even sharper. Even more urgent. The servant who entered looked terrified. In his hands rested an official document sealed with royal authority. The moment Alistair broke the seal and began reading, every trace of warmth vanished from his face. Then he slowly lowered the paper. And Elara knew their real battle had finally begun. The royal petition changed everything. Within days of its arrival, rumors spread through the kingdom faster than winter winds. Newspapers printed speculation. Noble families discussed the scandal over lavish dinners. Lawyers, politicians, and opportunists gathered around the unfolding conflict like crows circling a wounded animal. Lord Cedric Voss had formally challenged the legality of the Veyron marriage. If successful, the consequences would be devastating. House Veyron's wealth, lands, and influence could become entangled in years of litigation. Exactly as Cedric intended. Veyron Palace remained outwardly calm. Inside, war had already begun. Alistair spent long hours with legal advisors and royal representatives. Documents covered entire tables in the library. Witnesses were questioned. Records were examined. Every possible defense was prepared. Yet Cedric seemed to anticipate every move. Every day brought another complication. Another obstacle. Another attack. Elara watched the pressure settle across Alistair's shoulders. He rarely complained. Rarely showed weakness. But she saw the exhaustion in his eyes. She saw the burden he carried. And for the first time since arriving at Veyron Palace, she no longer felt like an outsider observing his struggles. She felt like his wife. One snowy afternoon, Serafina entered the library carrying a small leather journal. "I remembered something," she said. The sisters and Alistair gathered around a table. Serafina opened the journal carefully. Inside were names, dates, meetings, several references to men connected to Cedric's network. The information wasn't enough to destroy him, but it was enough to lead them toward evidence. Alistair studied the pages thoughtfully. "We need more." Elara's gaze lingered on the journal. An idea slowly formed. "There may be records in the city archives." Both Alistair and Serafina looked toward her. Elara continued. "Cedric has used financial manipulation for years. If he forged documents involving the Ashton estate, there could be traces elsewhere." Alistair immediately shook his head. "The city is no longer safe." "Then send guards." "That changes nothing." His answer came too quickly. Too sharply. The room fell silent. After a moment he exhaled. "I'm sorry." The apology softened his tone. But not his refusal. Still, the possibility remained. 2 days later, new information arrived from one of Alistair's investigators. A clerk in the city treasury possessed records connected to Cedric's transactions. The man was willing to speak. Only in person. Only quickly. Time was running out. The court hearing approached. Against Alistair's wishes, Elara insisted on going. The argument lasted nearly an hour. Finally he relented. Reluctantly. A heavily guarded carriage was arranged. The journey began before dawn. Snow covered the roads. Cold winds swept across open fields. For several hours everything appeared normal. Then the attack came. A fallen wagon blocked the road ahead. The coachman pulled the horses to a stop. Guards moved forward cautiously. Too late. Masked riders emerged from the trees. Chaos exploded around them. Shouts filled the air. Steel clashed. The carriage door burst open. A gloved hand seized Elara's arm. She fought instinctively. But the attackers were prepared. Within moments darkness swallowed everything. When she opened her eyes again, she was no longer on the road. A cold stone room surrounded her. A single lantern burned on a nearby table. Frost coated the small window. The realization settled heavily. She had been taken. Hours later the door opened. Lord Cedric Voss stepped inside. He looked exactly as he always did. Elegant. Composed. Smiling. The sight made her stomach turn. Cedric removed his gloves leisurely. "You have become remarkably inconvenient, Duchess." Elara met his gaze without speaking. He circled the room slowly. "I offered your sister an opportunity. You blackmailed her. A matter of perspective." His smile widened. "You are more stubborn than she was." Elara remained silent. Cedric placed several documents on the table. "Sign these." She glanced toward them. The statements claimed the marriage had been forced. That she had knowingly participated in fraud. That Alistair had manipulated circumstances for personal gain. The lies were obvious. Cedric leaned closer. "Sign them and you leave." "And if I refuse?" His expression hardened. "You remain here until the courts no longer matter." The threat lingered between them. Elara slowly pushed the papers away. "No." For the first time, genuine irritation crossed Cedric's face. Days passed. Then more days. The room remained cold. Meals were infrequent. Information was scarce. Yet Elara refused every demand. Whenever guards spoke carelessly, she listened. Whenever Cedric discussed business nearby, she remembered details. Names, locations, dates, transactions, conversations, anything useful. She recorded everything on scraps of paper hidden beneath a loose stone. If she survived, the information might matter. If she did not, perhaps someone would eventually find it. The work gave purpose to fear. Meanwhile, Veyron Palace descended into panic. Alistair learned of the ambush before sunset. The news struck like a physical blow. Search parties departed immediately. Messengers rode through the night. Rewards were offered. Roads were examined. Witnesses questioned. Nothing. No trace appeared. Days stretched into agony. Rosalind sensed the tension immediately. Servants stopped smiling. Meals went untouched. The palace itself seemed to mourn. One evening Alistair stood in the library studying maps when Rosalind entered quietly. She carried a small stuffed rabbit. The toy looked worn from years of comfort. "Papa?" Alistair looked up. His daughter rarely interrupted him during work. "What is it?" Rosalind hesitated, then asked the question everyone feared. "Have you found her?" Alistair couldn't lie. "No." The child lowered her eyes. Tears threatened. She wouldn't leave. His chest tightened. Rosalind gripped the rabbit harder. "She always says goodbye." The simplicity of the observation shattered something inside him. Because she was right. Elara would never disappear willingly. Not from Rosalind. Not from any of them. Something terrible had happened. And suddenly Alistair understood a truth he had spent months avoiding. The thought of losing her terrified him. Not because she was his Duchess. Not because she was important to the legal battle. Because she was Elara. The realization left nowhere to hide. From that moment the search became personal. Relentless. 3 days later a breakthrough arrived. One of Alistair's men identified a property connected secretly to Cedric. An isolated estate beyond the northern forests. Snow began falling heavily as preparations were made. Night descended. Alistair mounted his horse. Dozens of riders followed. No speeches were given. No promises made. Only determination remained. The ride felt endless. Frozen winds lashed against cloaks. Branches clawed at passing riders. Finally lights appeared through the darkness. The estate. Alistair's expression turned deadly. The confrontation unfolded with brutal efficiency. Guards loyal to Cedric attempted resistance. They failed. Doors splintered. Men surrendered. Others fled. Alistair moved through the estate like a storm. Room after room. Hall after hall. Searching. Refusing to stop. Then he found her. Elara sat beside a narrow bed. Wrapped in a thin blanket. Pale. Exhausted. But awake. For a heartbeat neither moved. Neither spoke. The world seemed to narrow around that single moment. Then Alistair crossed the room. Fast. Certain. He removed his coat immediately and wrapped it around her shoulders. The warmth nearly broke her composure. His hands lifted her face gently, carefully, as though afraid she might vanish. Only then did he notice the papers scattered nearby. Pages covered in handwriting. Names. Evidence. Notes. Records. Proof. Even here she had continued fighting. For him. For Rosalind. For Veyron. Alistair stared at the pages. Then back at her. Emotion darkened his eyes. "You gathered evidence while imprisoned." His voice sounded rough. "You fought for my family while I was still learning how to fight for you." The words shattered the final barrier holding her together. Days of fear. Exhaustion. Loneliness. All of it collapsed. Tears spilled freely. For the first time since her captivity began, she stopped pretending to be strong. Alistair pulled her into his arms. Held her tightly. As though daring the world to take her away again. Outside, snow continued falling across the estate. Inside, surrounded by evidence that could destroy Cedric forever, Elara finally allowed herself to believe she was safe. Yet as Alistair gathered the scattered pages, one document slipped from the pile. His eyes landed upon it. And the expression that crossed his face told her the battle ahead was far from over. The document Alistair discovered among Elara's hidden notes changed the course of everything. It was not merely a list of names or transactions. It was a detailed account of secret agreements between Lord Cedric Voss and several corrupt officials within the courts. Dates, signatures, witness names, and financial transfers covered every page. Combined with Seraphina's testimony and the records recovered from the city treasury, The evidence formed a chain too strong to break. For the first time since the nightmare had begun, Cedric was no longer the hunter. He was the prey. The hearing was scheduled 3 weeks later. Those weeks passed beneath a strange mixture of tension and healing. Elara recovered slowly from her captivity. The bruises faded first. The exhaustion lingered longer. Some nights she woke from restless dreams expecting cold stone walls and locked doors. Each time she found herself in her own chamber. Safe. Protected. Home. The realization still surprised her. Home. For most of her life, she had believed a home was a place where one endured. A place where survival mattered more than happiness. Veyron Palace had begun as a prison built from duty and deception. Now it was becoming something entirely different. Rosalind helped more than anyone realized. The little girl rarely left Elara's side. She insisted on eating meals with her, reading together, walking through the winter gardens. One morning Rosalind appeared carrying a blanket. Without explanation, she draped it around Elara's shoulders. "You always do that for me." Elara smiled. The child smiled back. The simple exchange nearly brought tears to her eyes. Across the room, Alistair witnessed the moment. Their gazes met briefly. Neither spoke. Neither needed to. The distance that had once separated them no longer existed. The day of the hearing arrived beneath clear skies. The great judicial hall overflowed with nobles, officials, and spectators. Everyone wanted to witness the outcome. Lord Cedric Voss entered with the same polished confidence he always carried. Yet there was strain beneath the surface now. A subtle crack in the mask. He knew the evidence against him was substantial. He simply believed he could still outmaneuver it. The proceedings began. Lawyers presented arguments. Witnesses testified. Documents were examined. Hours passed. Then Serafina took the stand. Silence settled over the chamber. She spoke calmly despite visible nervousness. She described the threats, the blackmail, the manipulation, the fear that had driven her to flee. For the first time, many people began seeing Cedric not as a respected nobleman but as something far darker. When Serafina finished, Cedric's attorneys attempted to discredit her. Their efforts failed. The truth remained stronger than their attacks. Then Elara was called forward. A hush swept through the hall. She stood before judges and nobles who had once mocked her. People who had laughed when Cedric exposed her. People who had viewed her as a mistake. A substitute. A fraud. Yet she no longer felt small. She no longer felt invisible. Months inside Veyron Palace had changed her. Rosalind's trust had changed her. Alistair's faith had changed her. Most importantly, she had changed herself. Elara presented the evidence she had gathered during captivity. Every hidden note. Every observation. Every detail she had risked her safety to preserve. The courtroom listened carefully. Even the judges leaned forward. By the time she finished, the atmosphere had transformed completely. Cedric's confidence finally cracked. Real fear appeared. Then came the final blow. Records from the treasury. Forged contracts. Secret payments. Witness statements. The corruption reached further than anyone expected. By sunset the verdict was unavoidable. Lord Cedric Voss was found guilty of fraud, conspiracy, blackmail, and attempted seizure of noble assets through illegal means. His alliances collapsed instantly. His influence vanished. His reputation shattered. As guards escorted him from the hall, his gaze locked onto Elara. Hatred burned there. But so did defeat. For the first time he had lost control of the story. The courtroom erupted into conversation. The scandal would dominate society for years. Yet another reckoning still remained. Countess Marvell Ashton. Unlike Cedric, she faced no criminal punishment. But social ruin could be equally devastating. Her manipulation of both daughters had become public knowledge. The noble women who once admired her now avoided her. Former allies withdrew invitations. Doors closed. Influence disappeared. The consequences arrived slowly, relentlessly. Several days later Marvell requested a private meeting with Elara. Against everyone's expectations, Elara agreed. The meeting took place in a small drawing room at Ashton Manor. The same house where her life had once felt impossibly small. Marvell looked older. Not physically. Spiritually. The certainty she had carried for decades seemed diminished. For several moments neither woman spoke. Finally Marvell broke the silence. "I did what I believed necessary." The familiar justification stirred no anger inside Elara. Only sadness. "You always believed that." Marvell looked away. "I protected this family." "No." Elara's voice remained gentle. "You protected your ambitions." The truth landed harder than any accusation. Tears filled her mother's eyes. Whether from regret or loss, Elara could not tell. Perhaps both. I never wanted to hurt you. For years Elara had dreamed of hearing those words. Now they felt strangely empty. Because she no longer needed them. Because healing had already begun elsewhere. She stood, offered a respectful farewell, and walked away. This time her mother did not stop her. Spring arrived gradually. Snow melted from palace grounds. Flowers emerged. Sunlight lingered longer each evening. Life returned to Veyron Palace. Laughter returned as well. Especially Rosalind's. The child seemed brighter than she had in years. One afternoon she raced through the gardens chasing butterflies while Elara watched from a stone bench. Alastair joined her. Neither spoke immediately. The peaceful silence felt comfortable now. Not awkward. Not distant. Comfortable. At last Alastair said quietly, "You changed everything." Elara smiled faintly. "So did you." He looked toward Rosalind. "Our daughter laughs again." The words caught her by surprise. Not Rosalind. Our daughter. The simple phrase carried extraordinary meaning. Weeks later a formal invitation arrived. Alastair requested Elara's presence in the grand hall. The message offered no explanation. Curiosity accompanied her there that evening. The moment she entered, she stopped. The hall had been transformed. Hundreds of candles illuminated the room. White roses decorated every column. Soft music drifted through the air. At the center stood Alastair. Waiting. Rosalind stood nearby holding a basket overflowing with flower petals. A few trusted friends and family members occupied the back rows, including Serafina. Everyone smiled. Everyone knew. Except Elara. Alastair crossed the hall toward her. His expression held none of the cold restraint she remembered from their wedding day. Only honesty. Only love. When he reached her, he took both of her hands. The room became silent. "I remember the day I lifted your veil." Emotion deepened his voice. "I saw a stranger." Elara felt tears threatening already. Alastair continued. "Then I saw a woman who loved my daughter before she loved anything I could offer." Rosalind beamed proudly. "I saw someone brave enough to endure humiliation without bitterness." His grip tightened gently. "Strong enough to survive cruelty without becoming cruel." The tears finally escaped. Alastair smiled softly. "And courageous enough to fight for my family even when my family had not fully learned how to fight for her." The hall remained perfectly still. Every heart waiting. Every breath held. Then Alastair lowered himself onto one knee. The powerful duke whom kingdoms respected. The man everyone feared. Kneeling before the woman once called a substitute. "I lifted your veil and saw a stranger." His eyes never left hers. "But I would like to marry you again." Emotion trembled beneath the words. This time not because of obligation. Rosalind bounced excitedly beside them. Not because of circumstance. A tear slid down Elara's cheek. "But because I choose you." The duke's voice softened further. "And because, if you are willing, I hope you choose me." The silence lasted only seconds. It felt like a lifetime. Elara remembered the frightened girl forced into a wedding gown. The daughter taught to endure. The bride nobody wanted. Then she looked at the man before her. The child smiling beside him. The life they had built together. And for the first time she chose something entirely for herself. Yes. Rosalind squealed with delight. Flower petals exploded into the air. Laughter filled the hall. Tears followed. A private ceremony began moments later beneath candlelight and spring roses. This time Elara walked toward Alastair willingly. Without fear. Without sacrifice. Without anyone forcing her forward. Only love guided her steps. When their vows ended and their hands joined once more, she finally understood something her mother never had. Endurance might help a person survive. But being loved for exactly who they are is what teaches them how to live. She had been sent as a substitute. She stayed as herself. And that was the only version of her Alastair Veyron had ever truly wanted.